Well, hello everyone. This is Andy Bannister from Solas, and I'm really excited to be bringing to you another of these webinars, these video interviews we do with folks who have written interesting books or got an interesting story. And I am really thrilled that we are joined again. We've had her on Solas Things before, joined by my friend, author, and speaker, and apologist extraordinaire.
I
Dr.
wouldn't go that
Sharon
far.
Dirckx. Sharon, welcome back to the Solas webinars.
Thanks, Andy. Good to be here.
Always good to have you here. Now, you are one of these people who seem to be incredibly prolific. I saw We Turn Our Backs, and there's another book out. You've written on suffering. You've written on mind and consciousness. We've talked about that and had you at Solas events. But you've got a newer book out. So what is the latest thing that has made its way from your desk out to the world?
Well, I have a copy here, and it is called Broken Planet. And it's actually another book on suffering, but this time specifically looking at the question of natural disasters, things like earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunami, wildfires, even locust infestations, and things that occur in the natural world that seem to require a slightly different response than a kind of general response to human suffering.
Yeah. And in one sense, I wanted to say it seems like a very timely book because never a day goes by without there being something in the headlines and the news around this. But
Yeah.
why this book right now? Because I mean, you could have written this book 20 years ago. You could write this book 20 years time. Is there a particular reason, Sharon, that now is the time that you've decided to write on this particular topic?
Well, the first book that I wrote was called Why, also here, shameless plug, which was, I guess, a broader response to the question of suffering. And as I began to speak on that, very often the first question that would come in response to a talk is, well, okay, human beings have freedom to behave well or very cruelly, but that doesn't explain natural disasters. So there was, in one sense, it was the next question up after a general kind of response to humans are able to use their freedom for good or ill. And I guess it was intended as a kind of a complement to that initial book as well, hoping that the two together can work well. In terms of why now, I mean, I actually it was the next book on my heart as well. Um, as you say already, Andy, you never go more than a couple of months before we hear of another disaster, and so I wanted to really respond to this. There are so many different kinds of natural disaster, and of course, shortly after the book was released, we had the Turkey-Syria earthquake, and more recently, we've had the Moroccan earthquake, and also the Libyan flooding, which are different kinds of disaster, and I discuss the differences in the book as well. And so it's just and part of the style that I have tried to approach suffering from is to engage people's stories of suffering with apologetic responses. And so I've tried to do that in Broken Planet as well.
Well, let's talk about that approach a little bit for a moment before perhaps we dig into some of the issues that come out of the whole question of natural disasters, because I was going to raise that very point, Sharon, that one of the things that strikes me about the previous book and Broken Planet is you interweave those personal stories. This time that really struck me. I mean, it was more sort of integrated within the flow of each chapter, I think, in the previous book. But in this book, you have you talk about an aspect of the issue, and then you have a story, a first-hand account of someone who's lived through or experienced natural disasters. Why have you done that? Why do you think those first-hand stories and experiences are so crucial in talking about this issue?
I think that any response to suffering has to engage us not just intellectually, though that is important, but it also has to engage with the gritty reality that many have faced in responding to natural disasters. And so and people are drawn to stories as well, and we can connect with stories in sometimes see our own story embedded in someone else's. And so I wanted to make sure that I dealt with the heart and the head as we look at the question of natural disasters. And so I have stories from somebody that was present at the Indian Ocean tsunami, who saw the water coming towards her, didn't know if she would survive or not. She obviously did. And and went on to tell her story of survivor's guilt, in fact, which is another form of suffering in itself. Someone who was in Haiti 2010 in the earthquake, and other earthquakes as well in Japan, and Nicaragua, wildfires in Australia in 2020. Hurricane Irene in Florida, someone that was on the highway in the middle of a hurricane who at that point did not believe in God. And so, yeah, just trying to trace people's journey and how they have made sense themselves of the fact that God may still exist, and you can still hold to the existence of a loving God and have journeyed through something as tragic as that. That was an important thing to do.
In the previous book, in Why, the very title of the book, right, implies the idea that we ask why questions about suffering, and that's interesting. One of the things that struck me in this book is the very word natural disasters I find interesting, because the moment you talk about disaster, are you then at that point bringing a moral frame in? Because it's only a disaster if it's inconvenient to somebody. So the very fact we call it a disaster seems to imply something's gone wrong. It shouldn't be that way. So is it once again that these kind of sufferings, these natural, when things go wrong, whether it's, a single person or something bigger, they seem to raise existential
Mm.
questions that atheism, I think, struggles a little bit with, right?
Exactly. And actually, whether we're talking about personal suffering or suffering in a natural disaster or large scale man made disaster, I am. It's one of the first points that I make, that if God doesn't exist, what are our options for making sense of this? And broadly speaking, at an intellectual level, many would want to say, well, this is just the way the world is, and humans behave the way they behave because of biology and the use of the freedom. And of course, in the natural world, well, tectonic plates are necessary to sustain life, and of course, people can be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this is just the way the world is. It's the way it's been made in order to sustain life. And we've got the laws of nature that in general behave predictably and reliably. And that's what makes things like science possible, which of course is heralded. Um, but this is just the way the world is. And of course, on one level, that's true. And these explanations are really helpful and instructive. But it doesn't make sense of our felt response. As you say, we feel these things as disasters because of the suffering that they bring. And why is that? And you could actually make a case that that reaction makes more sense if God exists than if he doesn't. Because if he doesn't exist, then we live in a non-moral universe, but somehow we've got this moral awareness or moral kind of need to respond to things. And where does that come from if we live in a non-moral universe? But if God exists, of course, we can say that we've always lived in a moral universe. God is good and has created a good world, but somehow that world has gone wrong, giving rise to evil and suffering. And so, in a way, the anger and the grief and the rawness that we feel in the face of our own suffering and in the face of watching others suffer makes more sense if God exists than if he doesn't.
Do you know something that you said there as well raises another question for me, Sharon? How do you think it is that that natural evil and moral evil fit together? Because I have this hunch that this tendency we sometimes have to talk about natural evil over here, so that's earthquakes, tsunamis, rocks falling on people, viruses. Then over here we have moral evil. So Vladimir Putin invades a country, somebody murders another. But those categories, I don't think they're as watertight as we sometimes make them, right? I mean, firstly, we ascribe moral agency to things. We talk about, it being the outcomes of the earthquake are not really bad; they're actually wrong somehow. But even then, because the human beings are caught up in them as well, sort of moral evil and natural evil come colliding in. So,
Yeah.
does that make sense? And help us
Yeah.
through that. How do we navigate that
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
world?
So one of the chapters in my book asks the question, why do so many people die in a natural disaster? And part of how I respond to that is to say that there's really no such thing as a 100% purely natural disaster. These things are always a combination of human factors and natural factors. So, one of the examples that I use is that we have become vulnerable, and human involvement often ratchets up the suffering and the death toll. One of the examples that I use is to compare the Haiti 2010 earthquake with California 1989, which were both a very similar strength earthquake. 57 people die in California, whereas, my son's geography notes tell me that 200,000 people died in Haiti. The number varies depending on who you ask. But in any case, it is several orders of magnitude greater. And why is that for two earthquakes, both in highly populated areas? And of course, we know that poverty makes people more vulnerable to natural disasters. We know that other things like poor building construction means that people die that need not have died. We saw this tragically in the Turkey-Syria earthquake earlier in 2023 as well, that, had building regulations been adhered to, then apartment blocks would have stayed standing in an earthquake. And so human negligence, poverty, which is often driven by human greed and corruption, structural inequality. And of course, there's the question of climate change and whether that, and I think many scientists are beyond doubt that there is a human role to the increased temperatures on Earth. And that increase in temperature has increased the frequency and severity of some kinds of natural disasters, such as hurricanes and wildfires. And also then leading to things like flooding and drought. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. There's no such thing as a purely natural disaster. These things are always a combination of human factors and natural factors. We could also talk about volcanic eruptions where people have failed to heed the warning signs and have failed to evacuate and had slow humanitarian response. There are all kinds of ways in which human choices add to the suffering in a natural disaster.
There's also, I think, the other one as well. There's also the greed piece, isn't there? That sometimes more could be done, but we choose to spend the money kind of differently. So I think you make a very
Right.
valid point that the entanglement there is fascinating.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And of course, we're also seeing compound natural disasters as well. Things like, locust infestations made worse by kind of deforestation, because that, forests slow down the movement of locusts, but because people are deforesting, that's kind of speeding that up. And that makes kind of landslides and flooding so much worse as well. There are no kind of trees to buffet it. So there are also compound kinds of natural disaster as
Yeah.
well.
The other thing that you introduced in your book that I thought was a really sort of fascinating idea to perhaps explore for a short while. You also introduced the idea that if you take Christianity seriously, part of the story that it tells is the relationship between humanity and nature is fractured. Right at the heart of the Christian story is that our relationship with God is fractured. That's damaged our relationship with not just with Him but with each other, but also our relationship with nature is damaged. So we're not living in alignment and sort of happy functioning, as it were, with nature as we were intended.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that a bit.
Yeah.
What's the unpack that, and why is that? Why might that be significant as we think about
Yeah.
this question?
Yes, I guess one of the responses there are different layers to how I respond to this, and I kind of take it piece by piece through the book. One of the responses, obviously, is that nature itself isn't broken. It's actually part of what's needed to sustain life. But then the second side of the coin is that nature is broken in some way. But in the first part, that it's actually our relationship with nature that has become broken rather than nature itself. That it's and one of the areas of brokenness is it that we've lost the ability to read the signs of nature, or we ignore them. But in the animal kingdom, where arguably that same kind of brokenness doesn't quite exist to the extent that it does in fallen human beings, you don't see that, and so you see a much closer relationship with the natural world. So there's some interesting stories of people that in the Indonesian tsunami followed cattle heading for the hills, and those that did that ended up surviving because this cattle obviously could tell that a tsunami was coming, and they decided to take their cues from the animal kingdom. There were also heard a fascinating story when I interviewed someone that a community that live inside a live volcano. I mean, not kind of absolutely in the crater, but within very close vicinity of a live volcano, but in a village of around 1,000 people, but no one has ever died as a result of an eruption. One of the reasons are that they know long before it's going to erupt, because the locusts start heading out of the cracks and crevices, and if they're packing their suitcases and heading out, then the humans know that it's time for them to do that as well. And so there are these signs in nature that we would do well to heed and listen to. Of course, the volcano starts spluttering long before it's going to erupt as well, and there are those more obvious signs. So I think part of the conversation is around perhaps we have lost a connection to the natural world in some way, or maybe we ignore it, or maybe we're so busy digitally now that we're just deaf to it. And so, yeah, I think that's a really interesting part of how we think about this.
Is that any help for us when we come to things though, like diseases and those kind of things? I could see how that might work, with earthquakes and things. That nature is more, other parts of nature are more in connection with the ecosystem. But what about things like viruses? Right, only a couple of years ago we had the COVID
Mm.
pandemic. Does that help us there? Can we apply a similar kind of grid to that, or do we go a different direction and say that something has actually gone more fundamentally wrong with biology itself?
Yeah.
How do we respond when it's more a
Yeah.
viral question?
Thank you. As I've kind of pondered this in the process of writing, I kind of realized that there are lots of overlapping arguments that we can that are helpful how we make sense of the natural disaster that was the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, for example, the argument about viruses being essential for life and necessary for life on Earth, and if you were to get rid of all viruses, we wouldn't survive for more than a day or two. Um, but actually, with disease and sickness, I mean, there's certainly a case of that. Perhaps we need to regain a greater sense of connection to our own biology and understanding of cause and effect. And I mean, I guess at the kind of the broad level, we do have a sense of, some things that are lifestyle related are not good for our long-term health. And there are all kinds of things that we could discuss there, and kind of being attuned to that, and playing the long game, and caring about that. I think that in the case of disease and sickness, we actually come to the brokenness in nature more quickly than we do with natural disasters, because with most natural disasters, you can make a case that they do have a life-giving role, a life-sustaining role. It's just that humans get caught up in them. But there are some instances in biology that don't seem to have any beneficial role. Take a childhood cancer. Um, and of course, this is what Stephen Fry was very kind of upset about on that in that interview on Irish national TV, and rightly so. What possible good could come from a child having a genetic cancer that is no fault of their own, not related to anything lifestyle related, and so on. And so I think there are more instances in biology where we hit this wall, where we say there's just something fundamentally wrong here, that it's hard to find a good reason for why this is happening to that person.
Hmm.
And so at that point, I do find that the Christian response that says, look, that there is something fundamentally broken in nature here, that we're on a trajectory towards decay and death, all of us. There's something wrong, there's something broken in the natural order that requires more than simply an explanation that talks about natural factors and human factors. Also, I find it helpful to talk about spiritual factors, that there is a spiritual brokenness has led to a brokenness in nature and in biology as well.
Well, on that kind of where the question of where God comes into this, let me just play devil's advocate for a moment, Sharon. Say, okay, well, let's suppose that we say that a God behind the universe makes a bit more sense. It makes a bit more sense than the moral judgments that we make, and perhaps that nature is a bit out of whack. But couldn't somebody say, yeah, but doesn't what's going on in the natural world, all of this mess that we're faced with, isn't it just a sign that we're faced with something like the God of deism? So we've got a God who's distant and remote. You've got a God who's wound up the clockwork of the universe, built it on a pretty good job until human beings came along, but then he's not around. He's disappeared off. He's no longer actively involved, because if he were, surely things would be different other than they are. Is there a way that we can, as Christians, as we talk about this issue, we can begin to talk not just about any God, but about the Christian God, who is very much not that kind of God? But I just wonder how we might respond to that objection.
Yeah, I guess, I think part of our intuitive response is to cry out to a being. And there's something inherent in that implies a personal being, not simply a detached and distant being. There are plenty of alternative religions for a more kind of detached kind of way of relating to the natural world. There does seem to be this instinctive sense that our lives matter, and if we just have the God of deism, it doesn't seem to be that our lives matter in quite the same way. We're just kind of on this biological treadmill, evolutionary treadmill, and so I guess at the heart of the Christian faith, it speaks about a God who has not just set up the universe and left it running, but has actually um, entered into it himself as the person of Jesus Christ. However broken our planet is, it wasn't so broken that Jesus wasn't prepared to walk its streets himself. And so whenever we find ourselves crying out for someone to engage with us personally, I want to say that finds a home uniquely in the Christian faith, which says that God is person, one in his being, three in his person as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and who has stepped into human history as the person of Jesus Christ. And so that speaks of a God who has not left us alone in our suffering, but has come to be with us. And actually, the basis of humanitarian aid finds its home in the incarnation, the notion that God has come to be with the human plight and human beings. And in a similar way, we are to go to be with others in their suffering. And I see that as unique, actually, amongst the options available for making sense of why we cry out, and why we cry out to a being who we think should regard us personally. The Christian faith speaks of a God who is person.
Do you know, that thing as you were talking there that struck me, that's intrigued me, Sharon, is there something particularly cultural about the way this question is asked? Because I'm very intrigued that when those natural disasters hit, it's often more in post-Christian settings, like in the West, where journalists like or celebrities like Stephen Fry, you say, popped up, did that famous piece a few years ago. But what I found fascinating in countries where the disasters happen, those aren't the questions that are generated. So the Turkish earthquake, you don't get Turks running around going, well, this proves there's no God.
Mm.
Or I remember sort of, after the Asian tsunami, hearing lots of stories and testimonies of people of all faiths, actually, not just Christians who were
Yes.
there. These were not the questions. Um, is there something significant about the West and the moment we're in right now that when these kind of things happen, this question is generated? I don't know what you think on that one.
Well, I think very so. The COVID-19 pandemic, in a sense, was a unique moment for us in the West because, in general, certainly in the UK, in our seismically stable UK, we are very often onlookers to others in their suffering in a natural disaster. And so we have more space to intellectualize it and try and think philosophically about why these things happen. People who are caught up in them are praying their hearts out to make it through the next day, and trying to survive. And so I think, yes, and I think that you find that that's right. In my interviewing of different people, I did find people interact with people of lots of different religious beliefs, and many of whom did not lose their Christian faith, or their faith in God as a result of what they went through. I think that in the West we have um, headed towards seeing the world in a very kind of material way, and I guess that is kind of leading us to think in terms of kind of physical explanations and evolutionary explanations as to why these things happen. But again, they don't help us make sense of the heart cry in the midst of them.
Well, I also wonder as well whether there's a control thing as well, that in the West we're so
Mm,
used to being able to, whatever the problem is, we can press a button, it will get sorted, and
yeah,
natural disasters do kind of wake us up. I'm reminded, I think you'll be very careful how one uses it. But C.S. Lewis's line about pain and suffering being this kind of God's megaphone to wake
mm,
up people from their slumber. And I'm very conscious
yeah,
you can overdo that with the idea that, yes, the reason why your loved ones got wiped out in a volcanic eruption was because God was trying to send you a message. Next
yeah,
time, quite frankly, a text would have been simpler. But at the same
yeah.
time, there is something, isn't there, that when suddenly we're no longer in control, it raises these really big questions for us, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And maybe I don't know if you're going to ask me this, Andy, but it kind of ties into the question about, are these things God's judgment? Because very often when a natural disaster occurs, you often have someone of some religious group claiming that this is the judgment of God, for on a particular nation, for a particular sin that they have committed. But of course, we see this is not how we see Jesus addressing this, and it makes me think of a situation where that he responds to, where a tower has fallen on a group of people, and they have all been killed, and he asks the people listening to him, "Do you think these people were any worse than anyone else?" And he said, "I tell you no, but unless you repent, you will also perish." In other words, there's something about when we hear about the suffering of other people that should actually not cause us to assess the spiritual condition of those people, but to think about our own spiritual state. Where are we with God? Have we actually done everything we can to make sure that we have looked into who he said he was, who Jesus said he was, whether he rose from the dead or not, and drawn our own conclusions on the basis of a very, a good look at the evidence? And also a reminder that these things are not the judgment of God in the here and now, but they are a reminder that life is fragile, it can end in a moment, and that actually the Bible does speak of a day of justice in the future, and these things are, in a sense, a reminder of that day. Anyone that cares about evil and injustice here and now, the notion that there will be ultimate justice later, is sometime in the future, ought to be good news in a sense, even though that sounds kind of an odd way of putting it.
Well, it's funny actually. I was going to ask you about the judgment kind of question, so you've preempted that one. Although, just interesting observation that struck me as you were chatting there. On the one hand, whenever natural disasters happen, traditionally it's some religious leader. I probably I don't know if you have the same experience I've had. You hear perhaps a Christian coming out and saying, "This is the judgment of God," and you sit there with your head in your hands, going, "Thank you, this is so helpful." I think Hurricane Katrina and John Piper
Mm,
was a famous example. But then it occurred to me, actually, as secularism just apes so much of fundamentalist Christianity, now it's actually, ironically, the ones who seem to be leaping for judgment are the secular environmentalists. So, something happens, there's a wildfire or a flood, and Greta Thunberg and Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion, it's the secular voices who are leaping up and going, this is judgment, this is because of the way we've lived. And so
mm,
there seems to be a natural human instinct, if we're not careful, to leap for the judgment piece. And our secular friends do it too. It's not
mm.
just Christians.
And to apply a meta narrative to sort of step outside and a degree of transcendence and kind of say, look, I see the bigger picture here, and this is my interpretation of why this has happened. And so we have this drawing to meta narrative. So, what is the most persuasive of those? There are all kinds of big picture perspectives we might choose to take. We are drawn to those. And why is
Yeah.
that?
And actually, there is a link here. That wasn't just a random aside. There is a link. There's two last questions I wanted to put to you before we draw it to a close, and one of them concerns the whole question of hope.
Mm,
Because one of my concerns, particularly around some of the ecology piece that I just alluded to, is, someone who's deeply committed to green things, but I also get very depressed that all you hear is doom and gloom. Humanity is going to get wiped out, that the wildfires will continue, there'll be more floods, whatever it is. There's no hope offered. And I suppose on atheism, there isn't, is there? I mean, whether things get worse, there's certainly not going to get better. One day, humanity will go extinct. One day, life will come to an end. But Christianity does offer something different here. Although traditionally, I think Christians have sometimes answered that hope question by saying, well, our hope is to escape this vale of tears. I
mm,
don't think you think it's as straightforward as God's plan is to just lift us off planet Earth, teleport us up there to heaven where it's all wonderful and the earth is going to burn. What does a
mm.
true Christian hope, Sharon, look like that
Yeah.
says something about creation to not just humans?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Two things, and in case I forget the second one, I will get to them. But the first thing to say is that, an important question that I ask in Broken Planet is, what should my response be to a natural disaster? Or what should my response be to this whole question? And part of that is kind of, helping and playing our part in helping others who are in need. And part of it is playing our part in caring for the natural world, the habitat that we've been given. And the reason for that is that the Christian view of eternity is not that we will float off to a ethereal kind of non-physical ghostly existence. It actually speaks about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven being more and more fully established on earth. And that began with the inauguration of Jesus' ministry, and it continues now, and one day it will be complete. And it's not that there will be heaven, but there'll be a new heaven and a new earth, which will be every bit as physical as this, but also it will be supernatural as well as natural. And therefore, the view that, well, if this earth doesn't matter, then I guess we can treat it how we like, if we are going to float off somewhere different. But if actually this is our eternal habitat, but that one day it will have this whole new dimension, then actually our role in sustaining it and redeem and kind of renewing it actually has not just a value here on earth, but it has a value that will last into eternity. And so there's an extremely strong biblical mandate to care for the natural world that begins back in Genesis, but it also has relevance to the very end in Revelation as well. And so there's that side of hope. And then, of course, there's the emotional kind of relational side of hope. I just mentioned the book of Revelation, but and of course, the new heaven, the new earth is also where human beings will see God face to face, this ultimate person who has entered human history we'll be face to face, and it says that he will wipe every tear from our eyes, and all of the tragedy, all of the grief, all of the trauma that we've experienced here on earth will somehow be, there will be a level of comfort and healing that is not always possible here on earth. And many of the stories that I've recounted in this book are kind of unmendable here on earth. But there is a mending that will happen in eternity, and that could only happen when you're fully face to face with your Maker. It says he'll wipe every tear from our eyes, and that's extraordinary to think. If you've ever wiped tears from someone's eyes or your children's eyes, it's such a tender act, and we're told that God will do that. And for me, that gives hope for today, and hope for the future.
Mm. And I think it's incredibly important as well, isn't it? Because I think I'm struck by, as you alluded to there, that I think it's really only the Christian faith that offers that real hope for creation. On atheism, with
Yeah,
every respect to our atheist friends, everything does burn at the end. It maybe
yeah,
not for tens of thousands of years, but it will.
yeah,
Buddhism, the whole point is escaping from this reality and leaving it behind. Islam, very much the same. The goal is to get up there to paradise and leave the world behind, which is
yeah,
destroyed. There's only Christianity that I can think of that actually does offer, as you put it there, that long-term hope, new heavens, new earth, and to going, yes, there'll be that renewal process, but just like in 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about we'll have these resurrection bodies that they're new, but there's also continuity, the same there for the
yes,
heavens and the earth. It's a staggeringly unique claim
yes.
that Christianity makes there.
And you're right to raise the resurrection, because that's what it really hinges around, the fact that Jesus bodily rose from the dead. He didn't rise as a ghost. People could, he ate and drank. There was a physical, he physically rose, and that's he
Yeah.
is the forerunner of what is to come.
So the last question I want to ask, you actually alluded to it a few minutes ago, Sharon, which is where you sort of take the book to a degree, which is the whole question. So how do we respond? Then we've talked about interesting ideas. We've thought around the question a little bit. But for people who read this book, and hopefully both Christians and non-Christians will read it, one of the things I like about your book is it's quite accessible. So what's the takeaway? Do we just close it and go, that's interesting? Or is there something you're hoping people will do? Will people live differently? Will they care differently? What's the call to action that Broken Planet ends with?
The call to action is to see that we all have a part to play in this. So, I mean, obviously, I want to try and show people, but that there are still very good reasons to hold to a loving, kind God who has made a good world, but that has gone wrong, and that there are people that have journeyed through unbelievable tragedy that still enjoy relationship with this God. But that we also have a part to play in our giving, in our shopping, where we shop, in our role as people, who we lobby for, what we stand against, that goes beyond simply virtue signaling, and actual action. And I speak from of myself in that as well. And then, of course, how we live in terms of our impact, our carbon footprint, the number of flights that we take, and so on. These are humbling, sobering matters, but I guess there is a very practical dimension in terms of how the book ends, that we all have a part to play.
So thanks so much for that call to action. I love that book ends practically, Sharon. It doesn't just end with pie in the sky, but ends with, what can we do? How should we think? But the other thing that struck me as well, I think the other call to action I felt screamed out from the end of that book is that what you believe matters. It really matters. And so my other hope would be people who encounter this, who are perhaps exploring faith, might be brought face to face with that question that,
Mm.
okay, if not Christianity, what's the alternative? Because even though Christianity may have some questions to answer, someone may come away going, yeah, okay, Sharon's 90% convinced me. Well, if you're going to walk away because of the 10%, where are you going to go? Because I think the questions, personally, are far bigger on secularism than they are on Christianity.
Absolutely. I think that that's a really that's at the heart of what I tried to do, and I tried to write this book for people that are not sure what they believe, and also for Christians who are sure what they believe but are trying to wrestle through this question. But I tried to make it accessible to anyone. And yes, if God exists, then it really matters, and it makes a difference, not just to how we think about natural disasters, but to life as a whole and life beyond this one as well. And I guess, my story is I haven't always been a Christian. I actually came to believe, became persuaded that Jesus was who he said he was and had risen from the dead as an undergraduate at the age of 20. And it really mattered. It changed everything for me. It's not simply, if it's true that Jesus has defeated death, and that's not just kind of that's nice for me, but people that disagree can just continue. It's either true for all of us or none of us. And so, encourage anyone listening, if you're not sure what you believe, look into the person of Jesus, check out an Alpha course, or Christianity Explored, or or maybe a friend who's been talking to you about their own faith. These things really matter, and there are things we can point to. There is evidence, and there are stories we can read that help us make sense of our own.
Fantastic. Well, Sharon, thank you so much for taking the time to have the conversation. It's been absolutely fascinating digging into Broken Planet. So that just leads to one very last, tiny, final question. Where's the best place for people to find out more about you, about the book, how to get hold of it? Where should folks go to get their hands on this this amazing book that you've written?
Well, the book is available on Amazon, but I also have my own website, which is dirckx.org, and my name is spelled DIRCKX for X-ray.org. And all three of my books are on there, and more information as well about articles and different talks that I've given.
Well, we'll put a link to that in the notes accompanying the video, and I'd also add, if people want to check out some of the other stuff that you've done, we've also done. We did a webinar with you on the Suffering book, so people have enjoyed the conversation that I just had with Sharon, you can check that one out and listen to that, and then go and get that as well. And then I'm sure there's something on the brain you've done for us somewhere, so you can check out Sharon on the Solar's website, and then go to her website and buy all of the books, and have some wonderful reading to take you through the next few weeks. Well, Sharon, it's been a pleasure as ever. Thanks once again for taking the time, and all the best for the book.
Thank you, Andy.
Okay, bye for now.